For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the girl who gets up at 3:30 in the morning to do the business news on Breakfast TV. That's my main job. I was expecting a bit of sympathy for getting up at 3:30. No, I'm not. Are you joking? We work harder than her. And basically my job to talk about what is going on with the economy. And it's everything from, quizzing the boss of Tesco down to being in a pig farm in Congleton, talking about parts of pigs we now sell to China that we didn't used to, and also finding out they quite like white northern pasty legs. And I was actually bitten live on TV by a pig. It was one of those moments where I thought, I was in this pig pen, and I'm one of those people who's like, I want to show off as much as I can when I get to go into these fabulous locations. And so I was there amongst the pigs thinking they were quite cute, and I said to the team back through the camera, morning everyone, and suddenly felt this pain in my leg and looked down, and these pig's teeth had gone through my welly into my leg. And I thought, what am I going to do? I can't kick a pig on national TV. So I just hopped around with this pig attached to me, whilst also trying to deliver some important business news. I'm not sure I did that much. For me, it's, that's one of my jobs. I also work for the Consumer Show Watchdog. So do let me know if you've got any problems with your tumble dryers or the like on the way out. And also I do a shopping programme, a consumer show called Shop Well for Less, which is all about trying to help families save money on their shopping, and that's on at the minute. I do spend a lot of time travelling around the country, talking to businesses. That's the bit I love. I spend loads of time in safety gear, so much so that someone set up a fetish website now with Steph in safety gear. One of those really tricky things to explain to your mum. No, mum, it's not a BBC website. But there we are. The thing about it is I find that I learn the most from talking to businesses. That's where I tend to get the majority of the information I'm then talking about on telly. Yes, I obviously do the big stats as well, but for me it's being out and about. So what I want to do, before we go into the brilliant panel sessions we have for you today, is just give you a flavour of where I think things are at with the economy, with the awful B word that I'm really sick of saying, and just in terms of what that might mean for you guys and how businesses are coping with it as well at the moment, all of the uncertainty that we have. I've just, as was mentioned by Mark, hot-footed it over from the Breakfast Studios, which are in Salford, where I spent the morning talking about Tesco and the launch of the new Jack stores, and all about now not so much the race for space, but the race for market share, and all of this, is stuff that I know will be of interest to you guys in terms of what's happening, and some of it, of course, you'll know as well from your own work dealings. But in terms of the overall picture at the moment, if you look at global growth, we are growing well globally. If you look at the UK, we've taken our foot off the accelerator a bit. Yes, we've had a great summer. If you look at one, figure of gross domestic product, GDP, how we measure economic growth, that was pretty good for the summer because we had the World Cup and the heat wave, and that encouraged people to spend. So that's been good. But if you look annually, for example, at last year, we grew at something like 1.2% compared to 2.5% on average growth before the financial crash a decade ago. So there is a sense that in the UK we're not growing particularly well, and who is surprised at everything that's happening politically and all the uncertainty at the moment, which I will come to. And if you look at the picture of employment, we've actually got more people in work than ever before. Unemployment's at a 42-year low, so on that front that's good. But wages haven't kept up with that. I get a sense from talking to people a lot that they really feel that for them, life hasn't really improved. We're starting to see wages increase above inflation. Is my mic going off a bit? Let me move to this one. There is so much to catching up to do when it comes to wages, and there was a recent figure from this on the Institute for Fiscal Studies who did some analysis of it, and they said average earnings now are 3% lower than they were a decade ago. So we're talking about 800 quid. So back in 2008 the average wage was £21,000, and now you're looking at around £23,300. So there's a bit of a drop there. In 2017 that figure was for. So household budgets are still really tight, and we're still driven by lots of people putting things on credit. I know from doing the consumer show that I do that there's lots of families that might look like they have lots of money. You know, they've got a nice car, they're wearing brands, but actually when you scratch the surface, there's a lot of debt there. And there's this sense of, you know, trying to appear like you're wealthy, but there is a lot of debt, and you only have to look at the insolvency figures, the people who've taken out IVAs in particular. At the beginning of this year, there were some 30,000 personal insolvencies at the start of this year, and that's the highest level since 2012. Katie Hopkins will be now added to one of those, I recently read as well. I'm not sure many people will feel sorry for her about that. She's once written an article about my accent, so I hate her. Anyway, we are an economy that's largely driven by consumer spending. I don't need to tell you guys that. You know, that's how this country gets a lot of its growth. And so one of the interesting things for me as a journalist has been covering the rate rise that we saw in August. So now interest rates going up to 0.75%. That was really interesting for me, covering it, because I don't do, you know, all the kind of big city number stuff. I just like to talk to real people on how they feel about it. And for me, I think that monetary policy doesn't necessarily work anymore, because what we've seen is mortgages, anyone on standard variable rates, going straight up. And this idea of trying to encourage savers to save more hasn't fed through. If you look at the savings rates, they haven't really changed. They certainly haven't gone up as much as the interest rate's gone up. So this idea that using interest rates to control prices, I think, doesn't necessarily work anymore, especially when you consider how much of our inflation is dictated by global prices, by the price of oil, by the fact that we import so many different products into this country. So there's a lot of debate about whether monetary policy works or not. But how I was more interested about is Mark Carney, the boss of the Bank of England, recently talking about what he considers to be the big four risks. And so he was doing an interview based on the fact it's been 10 years since the financial crisis. And as Mark said, I used to produce Robert Peston, so I was his producer when we were covering all that, which I have to say was like a hell of a time to be a journalist, especially when he seemed to know more than the people who were actually running the country. I was in an edit suite with Robert, and we got a phone call into the edit suite, because you don't have mobile phone reception in them quite often, and it was from Alistair Darling, the then Chancellor. And so he was ringing to ask what we were putting on the news that night. And he rang through, I answered it, and he was like, "Can I speak to Robert?" I say, "Oh, Robert," covering the end of the phone. It's Darling on the phone. "Robert, tell him to..." And I thought, I'm not saying that to the Chancellor. I'm afraid he's busy. Shortly followed by a call from Richard Branson asking whether we knew if Virgin Money was going to be able to buy Northern Rock or not. So it was like quite a staggering time, really. Don't tweet those stories, by the way, I will get fired. So someone's going to tweet them now. But it was a fascinating time. But coming back to what Mark Carney has said since then, you know, it changed the shape of so many things, the financial crisis. And looking at the risks now, he identified 4 things that he thinks are the risks. One of them being household debt. As I was just saying there, that's a big issue. The other is how are high levels of debt supporting the Chinese economy? And if you've seen the front of the Financial Times this morning, there's just hell on, isn't there, at the minute between China and the US? So you've got to wonder what impact this is going to have on the Chinese economy, these tariffs that are being imposed, and how that might then filter through to us, because it didn't take us long to be hit by the problems with people over borrowing in the US. So, you know, that is a genuine concern. And as someone who's interviewed Trump, I have to say, well, he's a twat for a start, but sorry again. The BBC, we're not allowed opinions, so, you know, other twats are available. But the reason I have that opinion, by the way, in case you're wondering, is when I interviewed him, which was before he was president, he basically had this big entourage of people. Whenever you interview someone like that, they always have an entourage of people, you know, their advisors, their PR, stylist. He had a stylist as well, genuinely. And all of these people were talking to me before I did the interview, and I had 10 minutes with them, a sit-down interview, and they said to me, you know, when Mr. Trump walks into the room, that's when your 10 minutes starts. You know, don't be wasting your time. That's it, 10 minutes, no more. Don't ask him about his ex-wife. Don't ask him about his hair. And I'm thinking, oh, my final question, what did your ex-wife think about your hair? Which I did actually ask at the end. And so then he walked into the room and he literally, hang on, I've got to get the hair right here. He literally walked into the room and he went, wow, you're beautiful. So he said, wow, you're beautiful. You're so beautiful, I'm going to have to leave this room to make myself look better. Because if we do this interview now, everyone's just going to be staring at you and not listening to me. Like, that's what Trump genuinely said to me. And, you know, as a good Northern girl, you can imagine my response. I laughed and said, oh, love, I've heard better lines than that down Club Bongo. I can't actually believe I've said that to the President of the United States, by the way, but I don't think many people can believe he is actually the President. But coming back to the serious point on this is, you know, that there is a lot of potential damage being done globally at the moment with these tariff wars and the geopolitics as well that was mentioned by Ed. You know, there's so much going on that it is a tricky time to be doing business, and that leads me on to two of the other risks highlighted by Carney. One was cyber attacks, and you know, data is such a key part of what is driving business, but also the problem of looking after it as well is such a big issue for companies now. British Airways, the latest to announce that lots of the customer information has been obtained by hacks. We've got various other companies now. I think it's pretty much like one every month, every couple of months that are saying they've somehow been breached by cyber attacks. And I think that is a genuine concern now. We're driving for more information from our customers, for more data, but actually also there's that real sense of how do you look after it all, and also how do you use it properly. Again, I'm going to come back to that. But then the final thing, and you know, this is something I've been talking about all week on the telly, is Brexit and where we are with it. You know, we heard right at the beginning there from Mark and Ed, it's just shambolic, isn't it? It's just, we're 6 months to when we're meant to be leaving the European Union, and we have no real sense of what's going to happen. And to do business in that environment is just so tricky. You know, we had the immediate impact of the referendum, which was, you know, over 2 years ago now. That immediate impact of the currency markets when it put a real pressure on the pound fell, that obviously made our imports more expensive. Food prices went up for the first time in a while, and it genuinely lifted inflation. Similarly, manufacturers did quite well out of it here, although they were often paying more for component parts they were bringing in. So there was an overall bit of a negative impact from that. Migration as well, a lot of people who voted leave voted on their concerns about migration, and it's really interesting since then what's happened. So I was in Warsaw last week in Poland and doing an analysis of why now so many Polish people in the UK are going back to Poland. So for the first time since Poland joined the EU, we've seen more people leaving the UK than arriving into the UK. And that, from just talking to some of them, is about the kind of pressure, the racism in some senses that they felt since the vote. And it's just created a lot of tension. And there was some interesting figures published on actually what a lot of immigrants have put into our economy here. Oxford Economics did this. They released it this week saying EU migrants pay £2,300 more to the public purse than the average adult in the UK. And if we look at what impact this might have on business, this, you know, not having the free movement of people, and also people just not feeling welcome here anymore, it could be really catastrophic for businesses. Although other people would argue, actually, it's a real time to try and grow our own talent, but that's going to take time to fill those jobs. And of course, what's been on the telly over the last 24 hours as well is the Migration Advisory Committee. They published their report yesterday, and they were advising only highly skilled workers should be allowed visas, which is obviously the kind of Canadian-style system. And already, lots of businesses are saying, well, hang on a minute, how do you define skilled? And also that's going to really hit hard lots of sectors like retail, like hospitality and manufacturing, where the jobs aren't necessarily seen as defined as skilled. But I would say, as someone who visits lots of businesses, it's really like a cheek to say some of those people are not skilled. You know, I think as a society, we value skills on such a kind of counterproductive level. You know, some of the most skilled people I know don't have a degree or even many qualifications, but they're absolutely brilliantly entrepreneurial, or they might be great at doing really practical things. And as a country, I think we often don't value those skills. And I think that's partly why we've got a problem with the skills gap as well. I'm forever banging on about how we should celebrate vocational qualifications more. So this year on the BBC, I forced what I call the Chino boys at work, the bosses, to put on a day where we celebrate BTEC qualifications and lots of other things, City and Guilds diplomas. I was really pleased to hear mentioned there that there's going to be a diploma in this area, in the specialism you have, because that's crucial that we value these people as well. And that's what will help fill the jobs that we need. So so we had a big results day, and it was interesting how the viewers responded to it, saying, wow, I didn't know so many people did these vocational training. So, you know, by saying to businesses, we're only going to let highly skilled people in, already that brings so many problems around what your definition is of that. But without doubt, the worst impact of the referendum has been the uncertainty for businesses. You know, businesses holding off decisions, they're, not investing, in some cases pulling out of things. And it just feels like it is a mess. It really does. You know, today we've got Theresa May in Salzburg, who's meeting with the EU leaders, where they're going to be talking about the Chequers deal and seeing whether, anyone fancies supporting it, essentially, over a few posh nibbles. And it's, to get to this point where we're 6 months away and we're still at this level of no one really knows, I think is really damaging. And so lots of people saying, what happens next? Well, if they do agree a deal, that needs to be finalised by November. Then MPs will, of course, have to approve this. If it's approved, then the transition period will kick in from March, and that will run to 2020. Now, if there is a deal, whatever that deal may be, it doesn't mean then we fall off this cliff edge in March. But the problem is the vagueness as well of the deal that's on the table. So we heard Theresa May saying this week as well to Nick Robinson, one of our big political chiefs, saying that it's either her deal or no deal. And the deal that obviously is on the table at the moment is this Chequers plan, where it's essentially access to the single market for goods, so therefore we'd have to follow EU rules when it comes to goods, and essentially that then could inhibit what trade deals we do with other countries around that. Also, there's little on what it means for services. We are an economy that is also services driven. We don't know what it means for that. There's also the issue around the Irish border. Michel Barnier has been saying today that there is improvements that could look like they might be happening on the border deal. But again, the language is very vague around what that is. The vagueness is what concerns me the most about this. And if we don't get a deal, there is potentially loads of things that could go wrong. Because with no deal, we then fall to the World Trade Organization rules. Some of the things we have with the EU aren't even covered by WTO rules. So you've got, for example, EasyJet are already now planning to get their UK pilot licenses through Austria because the pilot licenses don't fall under WTO rules, and so they're worried that all planes will be grounded if there's no deal. There's also lots of organisations like the IMF. You've got the committee, the Brexit committee at the House of Commons, the Bank of England, all saying it will be chaotic and damaging for the economy if we leave with no deal. The boss of Jaguar Land Rover as well said factories could come grinding to a halt, risking thousands of jobs. Now, for me, I think what's going to happen, obviously to be honest, all of us know about the same on this. It feels like even Theresa May doesn't know what's going to happen. And I think we'll probably get some type of deal, and it'll be very vague. I can't see a moment where everything's going to come grinding to a halt. At the end of the day, we still need to operate. Europe still needs us just as much as we need them in lots of trade senses, financial sector and everything like that. So I think we're probably going to get some very vague deal with little detail. Then there will be the transition period. Well, bits of it will be carry on to be negotiated as well. Then there'll be lots of legal battles to it. Then it'll get watered down again. Then there'll be a bit more of that. Then it'll get watered down again. And eventually, there will probably be, and I'm basing this just on hearing all the noise around me, that we'll leave, but it will be a bit of a signing on paper, and things won't necessarily feel massively different. Now, I could be entirely wrong, but I've probably got just as much chance of being right on this as anybody else who's working on it at the minute. And the worry I have with that, and I know from talking to the likes of Laura Koonsberg and people, is that this inevitably then is a blind Brexit, and the uncertainty continues, and that's the damage. Also, the preparations we need for the deal should have already been happening for years. So the government spent £2 billion on Brexit preparations. They've hired 9,000 more people to run it all. But the Institute for Government said this week the government hasn't left itself long enough to implement whatever the deal is. If you look at things like the London Olympics, the introduction of auto-enrolment pensions, they took about a decade before they actually happened with preparation. We haven't got long, and that's what the clear message here. But I don't want to bring it all down with that, because I'm sick of it, to be honest. If I never hear Brexit again, I'll be happy. The thing I am seeing from talking to businesses is that they're not letting this paralyse them. The business is doing well. You always have uncertainty in business. So they're making sure that they're not letting this paralyse them, and instead they're looking at ways they can, contingency plans. I think that's an inevitable part if you're particularly affected by EU rules. But it's more a case of looking at how, for example, technology might change your business. Mark and Ed were talking there about, looking at what you can learn for other businesses as well, and other sectors too. So we all still need to get on with our daily lives. Therefore, we still need products, services. We still want to go shopping. We still want to do all these things. That the EU don't have control of us on that. So we still need businesses to operate in the best ways they can. And the firms doing well are the ones embracing technology, and in particular disruption too. They are looking at how disruption might help their business rather than fearing it. The businesses I'm seeing doing badly are the ones who are going, oh, right, put your barriers up. We're not going to let them steal our business. Come on, what can we do to stop it? They're the ones not doing well. The ones doing well are going, right, how can we be part of this? We're not a hotel chain, but how can we be part of Airbnb, what they've done or what Uber's done or whoever else that's changing how we as consumers buy things and sell things or whatever else we do. And if you look at examples of it as well, of how people are learning from other industries. I was at a conference in Liverpool, and it was all about how they're creating a hub there called Sensor City. So it's all about the sensors we use in every part of our life, whether it be your car or in your house or whatever. And there was a guy who was a farmer talking about the sensors he uses on a cow to be able to check the temperature, work out the best time to milk them, best time for pregnancy and everything else. And in the audience was a paediatrician who realised those sensors would be brilliant on children, because they don't involve wires. They analyse exactly the types of things in terms of temperature as he needs to be able to measure on children. And then from that came this collaboration around how those sensors could be used. And it's that I'm seeing. That's one example of many I could give on how industries are trying to learn from other industries when it comes to disruption. Another example of as well around data and technology and why it's so important is I was listening to an investment manager, a very well-known investment guy, and he was asked by somebody, what do you think is the company we should be investing in, the technology company? What's the next big tech company? And he said, Manchester United. And you could see the audience go, what? And he said, because they have an unbelievable relationship with their fans, and they have so much data about people. Data that those customers, those fans, are very happy to give them because they want more from Manchester United. And he said that is so powerful in the tech sense. Every company now has to be a technology company to do well in whatever form that takes. But essentially, a lot of it is around how to use data. In manufacturing, an old traditional manufacturer might not be seen as a technology company, but if they're using the data from their machines to predict when their machines might fail, so that they can get them sorted before they actually stop and, stop the production line, then that is them being a technology company. So it's really interesting, this idea of using data, and I know we're going to be talking about that in some of the sessions, and also what data is doing and what technology is doing to change the world of work around us. The sharing economy is coming from this. The technology that allows us to do business anywhere is changing retail space, as you know. And again, we've got some brilliant case studies we'll be talking to about how they are actually doing that, how they're making these work retail environments for people. People on short-term contracts much more now, more freelancing. And all of this means, things are changing for people, and the people doing well are riding on this wave rather than going against it. Just in conclusion of things, what I wanted to say really was the economy is steadily growing. There's lots of people in work. But there's a lot of catching up to do before people will feel better off and the economy is flourishing again. And, Brexit probably will play a part in all of that. The uncertainty that's been created, I think, is doing more damage than when we actually leave the EU. And it is a shambles. But the companies doing well are the ones who are embracing and controlling what they can now, embracing technology, controlling what they can with their business, and collaborating as well, looking at what they can learn from other industries. So that's a flavour of my thoughts on all of that. But we're going to look at what this really means for the retail landscape, and I've got some brilliant panellists to bring up to the stage to do that. So please can you welcome to the stage. We've got Kim Politzer, who's Director of Research European Real Estate at Fidelity International. We've got Darren Richards, Deputy Head of Retail at British Land, and Pat Ritchie, Chief Executive of Newcastle City Council. Give them a round of applause. Darren, can I grab a mic? Darren, can I get your thoughts?
You want a mic?
I think we'll be all right now. I seem to be interfering with it. Can I get your thoughts then on, given retail is in the headlines so much at the moment,
Sure
I've been talking about it loads, our audience love retail stories, so they're very engaged. Yeah, thanks. That's my glamorous assistant there, thank you. And what are your thoughts on it in terms of what it means for the retail landscape?
Well, that question's going to dominate this conference.
Yeah.
It's to try and give you even attempt at a succinct answer to that. You have to start with the fact that, and acknowledge the fact that the mood music, the news stories out there are unremittingly negative. Too much so, actually. There's some big problems out there, big challenges, but what we've tried to do is actually dig underneath that and look at the facts, because some of the headlines are flying around. They're getting very morbid. There's a lot of talk about death of the high street, Armageddon on the high street.
Are you blaming me for this, by the way?
I'm not blaming you. I would never blame you, particularly when you're facilitating a session I'm taking part. What we've tried to do is look beneath that and develop a more balanced view. And there's two things going on at the same time, unfortunately. One is the kind of economic pressures that are facing retailers. So that's everything from business rates to living wage, and now we've got the big blanket of Brexit wrapped all around that. And that, if you want to think about that in terms of what's happening in the world, that's quite a UK-centric or maybe even a Eurozone-centric. Those are issues that will focus the minds of retailers and us as property owners, but specifically in the UK. The other thing that's going on, the bigger thing that's going on, and you alluded to it in your opening there, is the structural shift in retail. And that's global, and that's permanent. The advance of online has changed the way the consumers shop, it contains their expectations, and we're moving into a new era of retailing. I don't know whether everyone knows this, but we're second to only China in terms of online sales penetration. We're 20% now. Now the analysts think that maybe we'll go to 25 or 30. It may go to 40. And everyone thinks that could be a bad thing, but the truth is we're going into quite a bright new world of retailing, omnichannel retailing, where you need both because the consumer wants both. They want it delivered to the house, but they want to come to the shop as well. So if you put all of that together, we're going into this future. We've got the pain that we've got now. The transition to that point is for some retailers who can't adapt and aren't innovating, it is going to be very, very painful. We're seeing that play out in the markets right now. For some of them, though, and there's a lot of retailers doing a great job of adapting, we will get there. Unfortunately, we're going to have to grind this out because this is going to happen overnight. There's some big issues.
Yeah.
So big story, a lot to focus on, but that's the shortish version.
Yeah, yeah. And Kim, just on that point then, you know, given, as we were hearing there from Darren, you know, the sense that there is a negative outlook from the media, and also, you know, the outlook for the economy is not great at the moment. But what does all this mean in terms of investment in retail? You know, is there a lot of optimism there actually when you scratch below the surface of it?
I think that the investors are not particularly optimistic at the moment because they recognise that this is a period of pain to go through, and we've got to ride through that period of pain. There's going to be a lot of adjustments both in terms of the relationship between landlords and tenants and how we build leases and relationships that mean that we both share in the risks and returns from working in the retail sector. But there's also that realisation that for chunks of the retail environment, there needs to be a repricing. There will come a point when retail becomes correctly priced for the structural shifts that we're seeing. But there are large parts of the retail environment that need to be repurposed. And I think the challenge really for investors and also for local and national government is how we work in a partnership to transition, to create sustainable communities, because there's no winners if we have deserted shopping centres and deserted high streets in our local communities. But the pricing and the relationships are really important in making sure that works.
Yeah, which leads me perfectly on to Pat then, and just in terms of, you know, how do you make sure you have a good relationship there to make sure we don't have city centres like Newcastle, which I obviously love, that, you know, aren't neglected in some way?
Well, I think it is, as Kim talked about retailers and broader users of the city centre, other businesses in the city centre, working together to create the right offer that makes the kind of city and its heart, which is often retail, leisure, culture, a sustainable place that people want to both work in, live in, shop in and visit. And it's all of those things coming together are really what we're focusing on in Newcastle, working with the major retailers, working with landowners, with leaseholders, with customers and people to create a different sort of offer. And things like the Great Exhibition of the North, which you visited as part of BBC did a range of programmes from, things like the Rugby World Cup, things like the Heineken Cup, things like the fact that we've pedestrianised Northumberland Street, Blackett Street, has created a different sort of offer in the city centre that just makes the place more vibrant, interesting, and is kind of part of a partnership approach, and it has to be that. And it seems to me local authorities' role in all of that is to sort of convene that partnership, but not necessarily to control it. And planning has to enable slightly different uses, more varied quarters within cities, and slightly edgy places as well as your more traditional retail.
About diversity.
And that's a big challenge, I think, for the sort of real estate industry, because there's a sort of traditional approach that thinks that you can do a big scheme, and actually sometimes it's smaller, more niche, different types of development that are needed in places like you can see in Manchester, in Leeds and in Newcastle.
Yeah. Darren, what are your thoughts there?
Look, completely agree. Even if we went to, everyone talks about online, even if we went to 40%, even if we went to 50%, you cannot believe that we are going to become a nation of people sat at home, picking their noses, watching Netflix, ordering on Amazon. People want to come out to be together. And one of the problems, and it's not talked about enough, one of the problems for the high street is, and this is why these interventions are essential, is that someone has to create those places. And one of the problems with the high streets is they're so fragmented.
Yeah.
So and the classic example in London is Regent Street versus Oxford Street. Regent Street has got one landlord, and they've created a beautiful environment, and they've curated a set of brands there. not necessarily the brands that would work everywhere, but they've done a great job in doing that. That's the Crown Estate. And then you've got Oxford Street, which has got 200 individual landlords.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult to pull that together and have some kind of shared sense of creating a place. So you have to have these interventions from local government. You need people, the landowners, people like us who are prepared to come in and invest. And the problem we've got at the moment, which was, I mean, I completely agree with your point as well, is that the damage this is doing there's a danger, it prevents people from doing that. And so we need to kind of keep that positive momentum going.
Yeah. Can I check everyone can hear all right? Yeah, brilliant. Just checking with mics. So, Kim, bringing you back in on this then, how do you think things are going to change then in terms of the retail landscape over the next 5-10 years?
I think we're going to see a lot of the trends that we've seen over the last 5 years continuing. So I think that focus on creating spaces that aren't just about retail but are about leisure, they're about experience, will be really important in driving footfall. I think the media focuses a lot on the big glamorous schemes, but I think even in local neighbourhoods there's that need for a balance between local convenient shopping and other facilities that help create a community. So I think there's definitely a role in smaller shopping centres where perhaps there is too much retail, for some of that space to be brought back into other uses that are useful to the community. So I think what we've seen in the States, for instance, is a lot of conversion to things like medical centres, so light surgery workplaces and things like that. There's also needs to create more community facilities like libraries, coffee shops, meeting places for elderly people who need to get out and see people. And it's how you use the stock that we've got, particularly in some of these smaller centres where we're seeing retailers rationalising their portfolios and shutting down those shops. How we keep the heart in those communities by facilitating those alternative uses and bringing other people in to make that space workable. And conversion to residential is an important part of that as well, as people want to live in city centres now.
I hear a lot about this idea of multi-use as the way to make an area thrive. And you mentioned there, Pat, big cities, Leeds, Manchester, Newcastle, which have a very vibrant, city centres. I'm from Middlesbrough, so, we're losing our House of Fraser. I absolutely adore the place. I would never slag it off, but the town centre's looking really shabby, and there are a lot of people who live there who, and I often feel people go, well, why don't they go to Newcastle? It's a good 40-minute drive. My mum's not going to do that. So how do we make sure people in areas that aren't the big cities are, Pat, also, getting these areas which they would love, these multi-use areas? How do you kick it off?
I think there is a role for the local partners, local council working with the private sector to diversify places. I think the days of everywhere having its own department store and having a range of different things, we just have to accept are not sustainable. But you can have different sort of living arrangements. Students in Middlesbrough are part of the mix. The whole kind of role of the college, which has moved closer to the city, to the town centre. Arts and culture are a kind of vibrant part of that. If you look at Sunderland, and for, somebody from Newcastle talking about Sunderland might seem unusual, but if you look at Sunderland, they've done a huge amount with culture, where they've created sort of different types of theatre groups, smaller cultural events, a kind of whole cultural spring as part of their programme, and that's transformed bits of the city that were previously retail. Even in Newcastle, areas that were once office are now small art galleries, you've got theatre groups, you've got pop-up cinemas, and all of that stuff is about making places interesting to go, but with a retail offer that works for people. So you do need smaller stores, the kind of corner Waitrose, the other. It's just a sort of shift in environment. But the big thing is to work out a clear plan and vision for that place that covers all of these things and work with industry to deliver it.
And that plan comes from who?
I think that comes you've got to have strong elected leadership that really convenes that plan, works with central government to deliver it, but does it in partnership with the private sector. So Northumberland Street, we're investing quite a significant amount of money in the street, but we're designing that with our bid district, NE1, with partners from the retail offer, with stall holders on Northumberland Street and folk that use the street. And the role of local government is really to lead and convene that, but you've got to have a clear vision for what you want to do for parts of the city and enable that to happen. And also take a bit of risk. You know, the places that have maybe been most successful have invested alongside business and put prudential borrowing in. After the last recession, we kept going with Stevenson Quarter next to the station. We used our borrowing to kickstart that site, and it hit the market at just the right time. And it's that sort of innovation, I think, that you need to see in places.
Yeah. Darren, then, talking about leadership, which Pat mentioned there, what about Metro mayors then and their role in retail? Do you think they have one?
Well, I would say it's critical, because the partnerships we're talking about and the powers, if while central government's doing what it's doing at the moment.
Sorry, I'm going to get fired by the end of this, aren't I?
It's great that you're actually got this devolved potential power that's going out there, and actually we do need to unleash the shackles somehow, and Metro Mayor with the potential power to do that is something that's very interesting, something we're interested in doing. And it's very, very time-consuming. It's very, very expensive to change a place. Real estate doesn't turn on a dime, unfortunately. Development takes years, 10 years. Some schemes take 20 years, and we haven't got 20 years to get these places back on their feet. So I don't know whether it's compulsory purchase powers. I don't know whether it's looking at rates relief. It's anything that can help the private sector come in and sort this, because it's normally the private sector that can. So the Metro Mayors facilitating that is going to be very, very crucial over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah. Pat, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I would just add that while government is fixated on Brexit and doing what it's doing, actually the solutions to some of the issues have to be empowered devolution arrangements in places linked to mayors. We're going for a mayor in Newcastle, Northumberland and North Tyneside next year, but you need the power to be able to design skills programmes to deal with the impact of Brexit. You need to be able to deal with the fact that significant amounts of European money come to the north, for example. How is that going to be in the future? How's that investment going to come through the British government? And how's that going to be devolved so that places can shape their economies and their cities and their towns and villages to ensure that we have a kind of future that reflects the different economic geography of the country. And actually that a strong devolved, powerful group of mayors could really be the kind of alternative driver of the economy within a bigger macro kind of economic policy framework.
Yeah. Kim, can I ask just how investment in retail compares to other areas of investment, other asset classes?
It's definitely been struggling over this cycle. You know, it's definitely out of favour investors. I think investors are reassessing what role retail plays in their portfolio. Traditionally, it's always been thought of as being a very stable sector that generates good, stable rental growth because it's very tied to the fortunes of the economy. And what we've seen is that the structural shift to as e-commerce has grown has taken a lot of that growth potential out of the retail sector. So investors are having to rethink exactly what role retail now plays in their portfolio. There's a lot of been talking about logistics being the new retail and it being the part that grows because of the demand in e-commerce. But clearly it still has an important role in diversifying risk. And yeah, there are obvious winning pots of it. Yeah, we talk about it as one generic sector, but of course the beauty of investing in property is that you're not investing in a sector as such, you're investing in an asset.
Yeah.
And therefore there are still assets out there that are delivering great potential because they're hitting the right place and the right tone with these ideas of mixed use, etc. So I think there's definitely a role for it. I think it will play a different role in portfolios going forward. And we're going to have some challenges over the next 3 to 5 years as investors start to reweight their portfolios and rethink exactly what role retail is going to play in their portfolios.
And I know you were talking there, Darren and Pat, about how, while Brexit happens, we need to do things regionally. But how much do you think what is going on with Brexit and the fact that, we are meant to be leaving the EU in March, will that affect retail property, do you think, Darren?
Well, the truth is it already has.
Yeah.
The day after the vote, what happened with sterling, it instantly more expensive for retailers to bring goods into this country, and so instant squeeze on margins. That's not good given everything else that's going on. So it's already started to happen, unless we are dealing with a very dramatic, the horror story, whatever it's called. I've given up on all the names for different types of Brexit.
40 different
Worse
Brexits.
than no-deal Brexit, whatever it's called. Where the food's literally rotting on the dock somewhere and you can't come back from holiday.
And everyone's dying because there's no medicine and all that.
So let's just assume that Brussels and Westminster eventually realise that, as they get closer and closer to this game. So let's just assume it's not that, because if it is that, we've got bigger problems actually. There's all the kind of classic pressure point squeezes. What will happen with sterling? How do you move goods around Europe? Big issue. What is actually going to happen with tariffs? So you've got all that playing out. Then you've got the movement of people. Where are the employees going to be coming from?
Yeah.
That's a big issue, and how are people going to be moving around? And then you've got the consumer. Mark Carney might have stood up and given a very bleak outcome, and he was talking about worst case scenario.
Yeah.
But it's very, very difficult to see if this plays out how it could play out, how that isn't going to impact consumers through inflation, and then interest rates. And so you put all that together, there's big issues coming down the track at us, and we'll have to see how it plays out. The other issue, though, is, and you picked up on it in your address at the start, is just living with uncertainty.
Yeah.
I'd love to think we're going to wake up in March and they go, wow, thank God we sorted it. But we all know, whatever happens, we're going to be living, this thing's going to take 5-10 years to unwind. And so living with uncertainty is going to become the new norm. And unfortunately, that's what all retailers are not, it's what retail owners we're going to have to work together to figure out. If you want to take a quick analogy, a non-retail analogy, because half our business is in city offices, London offices. The day after the vote, everyone said all the banks are going to clear out. And this is why it's very, very important, and they're still saying that, by the way, 75,000 people, 100,000 people, whatever the numbers are flying out. When you actually dig into the facts, there was a select committee earlier on this weekend of last week, all the banks sat there and they said, look, if it gets really bad, we might change the plan. But at the moment, we're talking about hundreds of people. Citibank, 250 people. So, and these are, 5,000, 5,500 people. So when you look at the facts, that's not, and that's why it's so important in retail to always look at the facts. What's happened as well in London, it's created a kind of almost an unconventional cycle, because people said, right, I'm not going to build as many buildings. And then people are still taking space. So actually it's prolonged the cycle, which is actually better than we were expecting. And again, another similarity with retail, when you talk to the banks, particularly the global banks, they go, look, Brexit's an issue for them.
But it's not the number one thing.
HSBC, a global Asian-focused business, is number 4 on the agenda. They need to sort it out. They're worrying about how offshoring back-house functions to India. That's what they're really worried about. So again, it's all about looking at the actual facts of the matter rather than dealing with the headlines, because the headlines will crush everything with negativity.
And that's the key point about when I'm talking to businesses. They're saying to me, Brexit has created this uncertainty, but our bigger worry is the skills gap. Just Pat, then coming to you in terms of the fact that there is a lot of negativity around, sometimes that does hamper consumer confidence and things, but how much does what's happening nationally impact your regional decisions?
I think that the uncertainty that exists nationally is an issue, and you can't, we don't exist in a vacuum. So what happens at a regional level is against that context. But having said that, I think that there are a number of different factors that are playing out in different regions. So one of the biggest issues in the northeast is we're unusually an exporting region. We export more than we import, and that's quite unusual in the country. And for us, one of the big things is what happens to the big players in that market, like Nissan, like Hitachi and others, and how we begin to kind of work with and ensure that they are part of a regional plan, I think is key. The kind of other, I suppose the thing, it relates to something you said, I think, earlier. Businesses are using this to innovate, to think differently, and they are the ones that I think will kind of go through this process. And we've just done a big deal in the city with Legal in General. And one of the things that Nigel Wilson says is we're not remainers, we're not leavers, we're doers, and we're keeping doing. And I do think that's got to be a kind of mantra at the regional level, and then we'll plan for whatever Brexit ends up being.
Yeah. So to wrap things up then, just give us a quick flavour then of what you think the opportunity is in terms of retail over the next 5 years and retail property, Kim.
I definitely think it's there's a great opportunity to work in partnership to create really vibrant spaces in our city centres. I think that's absolutely key, and it's a partnership between the landlords, the tenants and the local authorities. UK retailing is very innovative, and you talked about that technology thing. I think that's really important that we partner with these perhaps new businesses. We don't get afraid of weak covenants, etc., to bring in new ideas as well as part of that process.
Yeah. So Darren, your final words on opportunity.
Partly it is just recognising that there is a lot of good that's happening out there at the moment, and the more that we can talk about that and the more that we can learn from that, the better. Retail has always been a very fast-moving, adaptable environment. Always will be. You talk about brands that may have not made it. I mean, there may be some people who miss shopping at Rumbelows,
Woolworths, I miss.
or Land of Leather. So, and all of the doom and gloom that's going at the moment, we'll always focus on that, and CVAs are focusing even more attention on that. I was with a retailer last night, great retailer. I won't name them. They'll be in trouble. No, and they can't get the press to listen to a good positive news story because a lot of retailers do incredibly well.
Can I just defend that though? If people are I get this all the time, and I would say my view is more optimistic in the sense of if it's a negative headline, I'll go to somewhere that's bucking the trend. But people doing their job properly is not news. It's when people are fit. That's the thing. People say this all the time. Why don't you do good stories about the police? Police doing their jobs properly is not news. Like everyone should be doing their job properly. So that's the tricky thing we're dealing with. But I get your point.
I didn't mean it actually as a criticism of the press per se.
Fair enough. Oh, I thought you did.
It's just saying that we've got to.
I put my hand to it.
It's just saying let's be balanced going forwards. That's the opportunity, and look at the great brands in this country. A lot of them British brands employing millions of people, and it's the everyday people on the street who work in shops. We have to support that.
Yeah,
so
and there are hundreds and as you say, millions of them. Pat, final word with you then on opportunity.
Well, I think we've got brilliant cities, brilliant towns and places across, certainly in our region and in the north and across the country. And for me, it's work with your assets, draw the university and work with young people, create places that work for people. And that's a massive opportunity. That's got to be linked for me to devolution, greater powers to make decisions at the local level that shape those places.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to end on. Can you put your hands together for our panellists, please?